appreciate that, and welcome everybody to Digitizing Municipal Records, a practical discussion. We have heard from many people across Pennsylvania who want practical advice on how they can set up their scanning program or work with a vendor, many other questions that we get. So we've tried to bring together a group of people who have actually worked with municipal records to get them digitized. And as Cindy said, this really struck a chord. We have lots of people registered. Let me just give you a 1-minute background here on the State Archives' involvement with municipal digital records. Through the State Archives, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission administers the Local Government Records Committee, which approves all retention schedules and retention policies for all the municipalities in Pennsylvania and the local authorities in Pennsylvania. And for many years, as many of you know, we had a policy that local governments could not destroy permanent paper records unless microfilm copies were created and approved by PHMC. But as digital records became more prevalent, we faced a dilemma, basically. Microfilm is terrific for long-term preservation. It will last practically forever if it's created and stored properly, but it's lousy for access and distribution. And digital records, on the other hand, are just great for rapid access and ease of distribution, but they're lousy preservation tools for the most part. So the hardware and software just changes too rapidly for digital records to be sustained for hundreds of years without a lot of effort. So in 2016, I asked the staff, and mainly it was Cindy's staff, the people you're seeing here on this webinar, to research digital formats and determine which formats might be viable over long periods of time, and then draft a policy that would allow local governments to keep permanent records in those formats. And their conclusion was that keeping records in PDF-A format, not simple PDF, but the archival version of PDF-A, was the format most likely to preserve records for extremely long periods of time. So a PDF-A policy was adopted, first for the state agencies. We did that in relation with the Office of Information Technology here in the Commonwealth. And then it was adopted by the County Records Committee and finally by the Local Government Records Committee. There are minor differences among those policies, but the gist is the same. PDF-A is the current preservation format. And these policies have been critical in modernizing local government record keeping. They became really important during the pandemic when digital records allowed many governments to just continue serving the public without missing a beat. So that's how we come to this particular topic. And with that minor introduction there, let me introduce the key people, our 4 speakers. And I'm just going to introduce all 4 of them and then let them take it from here. Anthony Hornicek has over 20 years experience in document conversion and information management, including the operation and management of 6 imaging facilities in various markets throughout the country. As Director of Government Services for Scantek, he specializes in assisting municipalities migrate to digital records with expertise in electronic records management, document retention policies, and best practices and processes to ensure successful digital conversion projects. And it should be said here, this does not constitute an endorsement, an endorsement of Scantek by PHMC, but outsourcing digitization to private companies is often the best way to accomplish it. And we're very grateful to Anthony for sharing his experience with us and outlining some best practices for working with scanning vendors and such, because we know that's a great option for many of you. Keldine Stambaugh will discuss how Paxton Borough funded and went about scanning their records. Keldine has 3 decades of experience in the private and public sectors, working statewide, primarily in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, focusing on management, development, and communications work. She served as a local government elected official for 10 years before accepting a position within the local government. Keldine currently serves on the board of directors for Pennsylvania State Associations of Boroughs, the Penn Prime Insurance Trust, and the Northeast Pennsylvania Lions Service Foundation. When we asked our 3rd speaker, Kim Kaufman, whether he would speak at this webinar, He said, if there's any truth to the concept that we learn through our failures, then I might be helpful. We thought lessons learned through failures would be helpful to all of us because we've all been there. For the last 7 years, Kim has served as the assistant manager for Sotara Township, where he works on a variety of projects and human resource matters. Just to name 2 of his prior positions, he served as executive director of the Pennsylvania Economic Development Financing Authority and executive director of Pennsylvania Industrial Development Authority at the Department of Community and Economic Development. So we're glad to have Kim here. And then finally, Vince Visakis will relate his experiences. He will relate how to pronounce his name properly, and I apologize to him. Visakis will relate his experiences building in-house scanning programs. Vince is the finance and IT director for Middletown Township in Delaware County. He has over 30 years experience in Pennsylvania local government, having worked for 2 counties and 3 townships in a variety of roles. So I think we have a great lineup across the board. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn the presentation over to Anthony.
All right. Thank you, David. And good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen here. So, again, as David mentioned, I'm as a government service specialist with Scantek. I work with municipal governments, counties, townships, boroughs throughout PA, helping them with their digital migration projects. I just realized I've been involved in scanning and document management since before PDF existed, which is kind of scary. But today I'm going to share with you some insights and recommendations based on experience working with government customers over the past decade. And now I've got about 20 minutes allocated to cover a lot of material. So I am going to talk fast, and I'd be happy to talk offline with anybody if they have any questions after this. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started from an agenda standpoint. I'd like to talk about the benefits of digital migration briefly, just to reinforce why electronic records make sense. And then we'll jump right into the crux of the presentation, which is, back file conversion, best practices and preparation, which is 3 key components: your back file conversion, which is, from a service provider's perspective, electronic document management software, and day forward scanning. So with that said, let's jump into the benefits of digital migration. First of all, one of the key drivers for digital document conversion is reduce costs and improve efficiencies. And this is important. When your files are digitized, basically you can, the ability to find them on a computer versus going through cabinets, boxes, it's a real time saver. Secondly, you can free up valuable space, eliminate file cabinets, costly rolling shelves, documents in boxes and the like. Thirdly, paper deteriorates over time, and probably the best example is I work with a county out in western Pennsylvania, and we were pulling old deeds, these tri-panel deeds from the Prothonotari's vault that had a wax seal on them from the early 1800s, and one of the staff members actually wanted to see a document, so I handed it to her, and she opened it up, and the paper just completely crumbled right out of the document. So it's a pretty vivid example of paper deteriorating if it's not stored properly. Another one is responding to audits and right-to-know requests. A lot of township and borough managers I work with where we implement document management always tell me how wonderful it is once they can respond to these requests with a digital file versus having to dig through paper and the like. So that's pretty key. And then finally, business continuity and disaster preparedness. I used to kind of, brush through this. Flooding is definitely God forbid fire, but flooding can happen. Water damage does happen. That little illustration there is, believe it or not, that's not from a burst pipe, but from a pipe in the basement where these large format rolls were stored that would leak from condensation. And as you can see, that's pretty bad. It costs a fortune to try and restore water damage or mold damage records. So that's something we certainly want to try and avoid. But other than that, really business continuity and disaster preparation was not a huge consideration until COVID hit. And then that created a whole new set of drivers for us. And first and foremost, is the ability to improve service and safety for your constituents. With digital records, your constituents could submit requests and applications online. They can get documents through public portals from your website online. It's really a huge game changer. And the other key point is that we saw during COVID really came to light was remote access to records for the office staff. If folks can't get into the office to get to the paper records, it's really hard to do their work. And that's kind of across industries. So that's where digital migration and document management are key. And then the other two key things that happened is David referred to is, the electronic records are now compliant. In the PHMC made that ruling in 2019, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, the SLFRF final rule, which validated the use of ARPA funds for digitization, which has been huge as well. So now I want to walk you through some of the best practices as we've developed them kind of over the years in working with our customers. First of all, when we look at a digital migration, there's really three key components. There's back file conversion, which is the legacy files that have been accumulated over many years, both permanent and non-permanent records. And this is generally, if you're looking to outsource, this is where a service provider would get engaged to handle this massive amount of boxes and such in the basement or file cabinets and such. The second component is electronic document management, and that's basically, a location to securely store your records in a digital repository so you can search, retrieve, distribute them. And finally, day-forward scanning, which is the ongoing digitization of new records coming into the office after the back file is completed. And as I mentioned earlier, these do tend to go hand in hand, and I think this will become more apparent as we get further along. But let's jump into back file conversion and talk about some of the key aspects. These next 6 items kind of underscore the process we typically go through when we approach a digital conversion project, and planning and preparation is really key. So we start by inventorying your records. What are the scope and the volumes of the records? And when we, assess a project, we convert everything to 1.2 cubic foot boxes. That's our unit of measurement. That's a metric we use to track record types, to track boxes through our facility, and to create estimates for the cost of a project and the volume. The second step is reviewing and assessing the population. We analyze, we organize, and we sort by record type. We strive to have one record type per box. From our perspective, that makes it very manageable for determining specifications because each record type's different. And then, of course, we determine the retention status, permanent versus non-permanent, which kind of segues into the third step, which is purging as necessary and providing the reporting on what's been purged. And this is, as I say, where appropriate for specific populations. This again depends on how well the records are organized, but the customer site, and I can tell you, over the years I've seen, every variable possible, and no two customers are alike. A lot of times you might have customers with documents in their file cabinets in their office that are pretty well organized. There's dates, there's record types, they're pretty easy to work with. But it's the stuff that's in boxes, that's been accumulating in the basement, in the mezzanine, in the attic, wherever, that can really be a challenge to go through and really oftentimes needs to be reviewed prior to conversion. The next step is determining, the documents that we are going to go ahead and scan, determining the file conversion specs, the indexing, the file naming. How do you want to search and retrieve these? Every record's different. Every record will have its own set of rules. And then there's unitization, and unitization is basically what physical paper boundary will constitute a digital file. We generally work at the folder level, which is what we recommend. The fifth step is, we'll build out a digital repository with samples. We'll review with the customer for validation before we move forward. And then finally, developing and confirming a project plan with timelines. Our project managers will create a spec document for each and every record type, and this can become pretty tedious when there's like 20 or 30 different record types. But we have to do that, and then we hold meetings with the department heads to review each type and move forward into production. Now again, I have this caveat in italics at the bottom stating that these will vary by customer depending on size and scope, the current condition of your records, the complexity of the project, and individual requirements. And again, every customer is definitely different. So let's take a look at a few of these in more detail. One of the things that we like to understand first as we go into a project, where does your information reside today? If it's paper, is it in cabinets, boxes in the basement, remote offices? Do you have film, fiche, all of the above, some of the above? Generally, there's boxes and filing cabinets. And then you have electronic records, too. What do you have on your desktops and network shares, intranet? Our goal is to get all of this critical data housed in a secure central database where you can access it and you know where it is. And we need to determine where it's located to develop a plan as well. So from here, we want to determine the scope and the volume of your project. What records do you want to scan? Do you want to do a phased approach or the entire project? I have customers will go in and they'll say, oh, we want to scan everything. Well, no, you probably don't. We probably want to take a look at what you have and determine, what needs to be scanned and what can be slated for destruction first. So a lot of my customers will do a phased approach, particularly for larger projects over multiple budget periods. Then you want to prioritize by department, record type, permanent, non-permanent, based on needs and goals. If they're stored in a space that's suspect or moldy or water damage, you want to get them out of there. Or if there's stuff that you frequently access, that might be the most important stuff to start, and that's what we work with you on. Secondly is how much paper do you have? As I said, we convert everything to a standard 1.2 cubic foot banker box, which is roughly around 2,200 sheets of paper, and we use this to extrapolate, what the potential volume is of a project, because that drives the cost and timeline as well. Then there's different, the transfile boxes are twice the size, vertical file drawers, 2 to 2.5, lateral file drawers up to 3, 4, maybe even 5 boxes. So, this is the thing that we have to take a look at as well. And then the next step is critical. This is what is the current state of your paper records? And here's where we see a lot of variables. Where are they located? Boxes and or file cabinets, oftentimes both. How are they organized, rather? We love it when it's, by record type, by property files, subdivisions, ZHB, road files, whatever. That makes it wonderful and very easy to get started. Are they in file folders with key information on the label, or are they placed randomly in boxes? Now, I have some examples here from real life. As you can see in the bottom left part of the corner, there's a stack of paper kind of roughly organized. We can't do a lot with that. Scanning and digital conversion is a great thing, but if it's not organized, we can't create magic. It really has to have some level of organization going into it. Or the box that says from Larry's drawer. It's not a very good index field to search on. And then you have your final box it's got the dirt on it in the bottom that's breaking apart. It's been in the public works garage for the last 20 years, and that requires a little work too as well. On the other side is a good example, is where you see a folder tab with the name on the tab that would generally drive the index, the data point, and we unitize at the folder level. Or if it's a box, that's great if it has the date and the record type on it. That makes life very easy for us and for the customer. The other piece is, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The other piece is large format that we encounter. As you can see on the 3 illustrations on the left there, people tend to just treat large format rather poorly. They throw it into tubs and bins. They stack it in the corner, and sometimes it's hard to make a lot of sense out of that. If they want it to correlate to a specific property or a subdivision or something like that, sometimes we can take it off the title block or the description, sometimes not. The example on the bottom right there, this customer took the time to nicely roll up their large format. They put a sheet on each row indicating what the indexing value should be and how it should be treated, and that made everybody's life a lot more easier. So I'm guessing there might be a few of us looking at this that can relate to some of these photos. Don't feel bad. I can tell you this seems like almost every customer has at least some portion of their population that looks a little bit like this, that have been documents that have been neglected, I will say. So moving forward, once we have a clear picture of the overall project, and if it's a situation where at least a portion of the records are poorly organized, in some cases that's about half of our customers, We need to determine what records can be kept and scanned and what can be disposed of. And we do this by performing a physical review of the documents. And we start by separating, of course, permanent versus non-permanent. Then, of course, we purge any expired non-permanent records prior to scanning, and the purge depends upon how well the records are organized. If it's a box that's got a bunch of loose paper in it, that can be very tedious. At least if it has a record type or some information on it, the more information, the better. But we recommend typically permanent retention or non-permanent with 3+ years remaining, scan it as PDFA, store it digitally, and you have the option to destroy following validation of the deliverables and notification of PHMC per the guidelines. If there's less than 3 years remaining on a non-permanent record, we recommend don't scan it because you can be able to shred it in 3 years. Securely store it until the disposition date, and then you have the option to destroy, and we could do scan on demand for interim file requests. And finally, those that are past the retention date, we go ahead and destroy. But we want to be sure, you obtain a certificate of secure destruction, of course, from your shredding service. Now, the above process can be time-consuming, but it's certainly a lot less costly than scanning stuff that doesn't need to be scanned. And government records are somewhat complex as compared to other customers that, generally have just a few record types like student records, HR, maybe even medical records. By contrast, the municipal record manual has about, I believe, 16 primary categories or citations and about another 300 different record types or series. But the good news is it lists a retention policy and procedures for each one of those record types. And that is a wonderful thing. It makes it very easy, and it's taken the guesswork out of it for everybody, which is great, because I can tell you we work with customers in other industries that don't have that, and we have to engage with a partner, information governance firm, to create a records manual and retention periods, and that can be time-consuming and very costly. So it's a great tool. This graphic here just illustrates we've taken and dropped it into Excel. We use this when we go through records assessment, with the record type and description and the citation and the series, and then you've got your retention period and columns on the right. This kind of facilitates it for our document specialists. So here I just wanted to touch on the treatment of permanent records and the guidelines developed by the PHMC in 2019, which states that electronic records can now replace paper for permanent retention. And then there are, however, of course, specific requirements that must be adhered to. First of all, of course, they must be stored in PDFA format. Secondly, the PHMC must be notified. I believe it's Appendix E in the records manual that lists the description and citation for each record series that's going to be retained electronically. And then finally, there are specific requirements surrounding digital storage of those files once they're electronic. You have a working copy, you have your security preservation file, and you have a backup of the security preservation file. It's essentially a backup of the backup, but these all need to be adhered to and saved either in an online environment. The security preservation file backup needs to be stored at a separate geographic location. So some specific procedures to follow. They can be a bit tedious. Currently, probably about 25% of our customers will go right into it and do this, and we work with them on that. Some of the others might want us to hold the records for a year, or they'll hold on to them, the permanent ones, and then the board or the council will go ahead and say, okay, let's move forward with this. So people are more and more moving this direction, which is a good thing. It makes sense. Now, for the records we're going to go ahead and scan, we need to determine the specifications for each record type. I think I talked about that, but this is a critical part of the process because it plays a key role in the success of the project in terms of being able to search and retrieve your files with ease. So we spend a lot of time on this up front. We work with our customers to understand what they have and how we're going to organize it and how we're going to name it and unitize it. And of course, unitization is basically the logical document boundaries. We can't do much with a stack of loose sheets or a box of loose sheets of paper. Generally we like to work with the folder level unitization with a tab, and it's got the information. There's a property file. It might have a street address, tax parcel ID. That's what we'll index it from. That's the indexing for search and retrieval. And then there's also the option for OCR, which is optical character recognition, which enables full text search, only computer generated documents. I want to mention not for handwritten. But this table at the bottom of this slide is basically just a clip I took out of a sheet that we give to our customers and we work with them on to determine, the record type, the unitization, the indexing, data fields, data points, where they're located, and any other comments. Again, I'm showing this because I'm trying to emphasize how important that is to understand, and if you're using an outsourcing provider, that they understand what your requirements are and how they're going to index your records for search and retrieval. So just in closing on the backfile piece, there's really three primary types of documents that we work with from a physical document type. There's bound books, generally your minutes, ordinances, resolutions, large format, which comes in a variety of flavors: flat, in drawers, hanging, rolled, folded, stuffed within a file folder. So depending on how it's set up, and we've seen all of the above in one customer's location, you want to determine how that's to be treated. And then finally, your standard files, which is the majority of the records that are less than 11 by 17 or less. But they all require different treatment, different scanning procedures, and that's important, obviously, to understand that as well. So now let's move on to electronic document management software, which is kind of the next piece of the equation. When it comes to document software, there's many options out there. Some are really good. Others might not be so good and really difficult to use. Some are very affordable, and some are extremely costly. I want to cover some things quickly to look for when choosing the right software, but first I want to touch on the benefits of document management as opposed to just dropping your files into Windows Explorer. So first and foremost, document management software enables instant search, retrieval, and distribution of your files. You can search the metadata or the index values, the ability to search multiple data points, kind of like digital cross-filing. Again, the example of a property file, you might have street address, tax parcel ID, whatever else. You can search on multiple points, and of course OCR. Increase security and control of your records. You can set access rights, permissions. You can lock down files. A good system should have an audit trail. And then it ensures compliance and reliable backups, particularly for a cloud-based. And then provides remote access to records, like we talked about earlier, which is a key consideration for your staff and constituents. And then the streamline of information exchange, workflow and collaboration, automating paper-based tasks. And these are just some of the more immediate benefits of the software. But I'm going to look at some things to consider if you're choosing a system also. First and foremost is you want to look at cloud or on-prem. I will tell you that about 98% of our implementations are cloud-based. It's very easy to implement. We can do it remotely, doesn't require IT support, and there's no server required. So that's really the way it seems like everybody's going now. The other piece that's very important is ease of use, logical interface. You want to see a demo of the software and make sure that it makes sense and you can understand it. I've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and I've seen software out there I still don't understand. So that's important. And then the advanced features like workflow, application integration. Can you integrate with a GIS platform, or accounting platform, e-forms, public portal, so your constituents can submit, requests online, records retention. These are something that might not be very important the first year. You just want to be able to search, retrieve, distribute, download. But after about a year or so, folks come back and they say, what else can we do with this? So it should have some of those robust features. Security is critical, obviously. And then references in the government space are important, and cost, finally, licenses, support, storage. But finally, I think the most important thing is from my perspective is, most all document management software is handled by resellers. And just like anything else, some are good and experienced, some not so much. And I can tell you the successful implementation of your system really is determined by the qualifications, expertise, and training offered by your service provider. So let's move on to the final component, which is day forward scanning. So if you got your key items in place, backfile conversion is completed, your document management software is implemented, the initial system architecture is built out, you've uploaded backfile images and metadata and built that out with that, and the staff's been trained on your software. So some considerations. If you want to do the day forward stuff, who's going to do the scanning? Is it going to be centralized, one person, a dedicated device, or decentralized, multiple staff members and devices? I have customers doing it both ways. Some have a desktop scanner on the department heads' desks, others just have a centralized scanner. A lot are using their MFP or their multifunction device, which works fine in many cases. The biggest thing here that I've seen, though, is that second bullet, the file naming conventions, document templates. You know, the last thing you want is to have 5 or 6 people scanning and uploading the same document, but everybody naming it something differently. And that does happen. You've got to be consistent, and that's where with document management software, you have templates that will force you to name a certain type of document with a drop-down, and that's very key. So you can find it later when you're looking for it. And then the equipment, you know, you want to make sure you have 11 by 17 capacity. Like I said, your networked MFD is generally the way to go, but you should also have PFA capability for the capture software, which can, most of the new MFPs have that, or it can be added on with the module. And then finally, large format. You know, you certainly don't want to go out and spend $8,000 on a large format machine. A lot of my customers will just go ahead and outsource that. A lot of customers are requiring the large format to be submitted electronically anyway, so that generally is not a big issue, but just something you want to consider. So again, as I said, I had to breeze through this pretty quickly due to the time limitations. I know there's questions at the end, but here's my contact info also. If you want to chat for any additional information, just reach out and I'd be happy to speak with you. So thanks again for your time and your interest. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point so we can move on. That's it.
Our next speaker is Keldine Stanbaugh. She's going to get her slides ready. And we've actually had a couple of questions about whether our people will be sending out their slide deck. And I think that is a possibility that they will be able to do that.
Okay. Good morning. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar this morning. Tony shared the technical details of the proper process, and that was a very good presentation, Tony, packed full of useful information. Now I am going to share my personal experience as a non-expert in document preservation and digitizing, just from the perspective of a small municipality in Pennsylvania. So you do not need to actually wave your hand to answer the questions coming up here, but how many of you have a small staff? How many of you have a limited budget? And how many have an overwhelming amount of paper documents or not enough time in the workday to tackle major projects? Well, Paksang Borough is all of the above, and the digitizing project did not happen overnight. But we aim for progress and not for perfection. And if you want to digitize your documents, I am here to let you know there is hope for you also. So we do what we can, when we can, with what we have available. And I will share our path to preserving our local history and important documents in our small borough, transitioning from file boxes and binders to a faster, more efficient computer search. There we go. I apologize. I'm also challenged in the computers. First, let me introduce our little municipality. So the borough of Paksang was incorporated on July 3rd, 1914. Paksang is a walking community with a population of 1,640 persons, which includes approximately 700 homes with no room to develop or grow. Our commercial zones include predominantly small businesses, and we are nestled between Swatara Township, Susquehanna Township, and Harrisburg City in Dauphin County. Many residents know each other by name or by their dog's name, and our small community has much history, from prominent political names to beautiful old architecture and the well-known Capital Area Greenbelt Trail. So our municipal building is equally well aged, as it was built in 1932, and with that comes all the fun aspects of an old building. Inside the vault, which is what we call it, which is simply an odd-shaped storage room with exposed brick walls and a vault bank door used for office supplies and documents. In our basement, we store items from the Historical Society and, of course, more files from years of past. So we use dehumidifiers in our basement to keep moisture issues under control. And we are fortunate to have a strong financial health due to our fiscal conservative approach to spending over the decades. So staying on this course, we get resourceful with problem solving. The problem identified in this story was paper, paper, and more paper, which is not too uncommon in a small municipality with a small staff and limited resources. So I quickly discovered, as quaint and nostalgic as it was to have historic records and binders to page through at one's leisure, we needed to improve the efficiency of the office. So time management was often derailed by what would appear to be a simple inquiry. And I know that was referenced in Tony's as well, especially when it comes to right to know request, which we all can relate to. So since 2015, we implemented a few things. Use more technology, which included saving documents electronically in-house. For example, if a signed contract agreement came to the office, in addition to filing the paper copy, the document is scanned and saved on our network. So the borough ordinances were codified and made available through something called e-code on our borough website. And if you wanted to look at that, it's paxtang.org. We added forms and general information for residents and businesses to print and download from our website rather than physically come into the office during business hours. We also implemented the use of an internet-based program, CS Datum, which was created by CS Davidson engineers, for staff to upload the digital maps kept by our borough contracted engineer for our public works staff to use electronic tablets in the field instead of those large paper maps all the time when reviewing underground utilities and the ability to inventory and manage signs, and also our shade trees. Storage space was at a premium. So we referenced the Pennsylvania Municipal Record Retention Guidelines by our wonderful state archives, and recruited a few authorized volunteers, and one evening a week for a few months, we tackled reviewing the boxes. We properly logged and disposed of 50 boxes of documents in the first cycle and another 50 boxes in the second cycle. And that put a very large dent in our problem. The next step was identifying our needs. So first and foremost was the reality of what most municipalities face every day: problems. Seems like we're always putting out fires, we're always reacting. So we are tasked with solving them, whether they are our own problem, an expectation from another entity, maybe another agency, or someone else's problem. In this case, we are all one step away from a minor disaster, and we love it there. It's in the municipal building. It could be a leaky roof, broken pipe, spill, copier paper eating, or a fire, just to name a few. Protecting the remaining documents from potential emergencies or disasters is ultimately our responsibility. Another need is improving the inefficiencies of searching for paperwork in boxes stored in the basements and closets and cabinets in the vault. We have all experienced the head-scratching moment when you discover a document that was placed in the wrong file. Or even more fun, searching for a document that is no longer where it should be, or even that it was 2 weeks ago. Lastly, locating the previous decades of and previous employees' filing systems in the corners and crevices of the building where they were stored. From previous professional experiences, it was obvious we needed to make improvements. We needed a more efficient way to find permits and general documents from past years, and digitizing was the solution. The issues for moving forward are probably similar, but most important was our small borough did not have excess funds to do the amount of scanning that was needed. But the project was eligible for funds from American Rescue Plan Act. That's the ARPA funds that I believe all of us have received. Borough Council allowed us to improve our administrative approach for staff and service to our citizens. We contracted with Higher Information Group of South Central PA and to plan and implement. We labeled and batched the boxes and had several successful box pickups and returns. And we are currently reviewing the remaining sections of files in the basement, the final sections of files in the basement, for purging and completion of the scanning portion of the project. We are also sorting old maps so as not to duplicate efforts. Again, what Tony referenced is, you don't want to duplicate or, spend funds where you don't need to. Maps already in digital form, for example, by our engineer, versus the paper mats that are stacked in the closet on a shelf. Some of which are outdated, some of which have been, replaced or otherwise. Reviewing our growing information technology space needs would be number 3. And number 4, developing a daily process for scanning in the office and discussing best practices for organizing those electronic files for interoffice searches. And Tony also referenced that, and that is a very valid point. It can get very messy on the back end if you don't make a plan as you go along. So mine was a little bit shorter. And again, I'm also available to answer questions later. And so this would conclude my presentation. And the moral of my story is slow and steady worked for us as a small municipality. And remember to take just one step at a time. And it doesn't need to be perfect, just make progress. And with that, I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Kaldeen. Next is Kim. All right.
Good morning, everyone. I want to start out by thanking our friends at State Archives, our participants today, and all of our presenters. This is an excellent topic, and for all of you who are dealing with this on a regular basis, it's a challenge. And very few things can be more challenging than a project that doesn't go particularly well. And that's really my job today, is to talk about that. We talked a little bit as a group yesterday, and we decided that I'm going to serve as your bad example. So all of the things I'm going to tell you about that didn't go very well, I'm telling you these things, and we're talking about our mistakes so you don't have to repeat them. So that's kind of where we're going to go today. And I'll go to the next slide. There's an old quote here, and different people take credit for this quote, but there's a lot to be said about it. Good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. You may hear this in your professional careers, and I encourage you to take a note of that, because we all think we have the best ideas going forward. And unfortunately, sometimes we learn from that experience that things could have been done a great deal better. Our experience with regard to file management, specifically the preservation of old files, goes back about 7 or 8 years ago, about the time I started with the township. And at that particular time, we were looking at how we wanted to do something with our files and what was going to drive the need to proceed at that point. So we'll go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Give you some background. At that particular time, the township was looking at an entire new municipal complex. And one of the things, if you dealt with that challenge in your own establishment, is that there's never enough room for people and for files. And in looking at that, we decided, well, the best thing we can do to save money and to save space is to take some of the most cumbersome files that we have and turn them into an electronic format. We contacted the Historic Museum Commission, and they were very kind about coming out and indulging all of our ignorance and telling us all the rules that we needed to live by. And at that particular time, you really couldn't do both things. You couldn't just convert your files over to electronic and then get rid of the hard copy. At that point, the legislation was such that it hadn't advanced that far. You still had to retain all of your hard copy and have your electronic version. So, you know, it was kind of the type of thing where you do it with the idea that, okay, sometime in the future, we can get rid of the hard copy, so we'll deal with that part of it later. We looked at using our codes office, because our codes office has some of the oldest files going back 40, 50 years in many cases, and some of those cumbersome files. We have the standard 8.5 by 11 types of things, but then we have blueprints and drawings and things of that nature that were sometimes 3 and 4 feet by 6 feet. And hand done and quite lovely, but by the same token, completely unmanageable in terms of the amount of space it took to do those. We reached out and we looked for a firm that would be able to help us out. And in talking with the Historic Museum Commission, the format that we were talking about at that time is now PDF-A. At that time was PDF-A 1A. So we were looking for a firm that could help us digitize, take records, copy, do all of those things for us, because the size of the documents that we were dealing with were such that there was no way we had the equipment to deal with those types of things, let alone the staff to deal with it. At the time that we were looking and we're doing some searching for that, it just so happened that a firm came in the door one day with a sales representative, and that was exactly their area of business. Let me tell you a mistake, and that is a firm coming in with a salesperson to tell you that they can do exactly what you need them to do is probably not the level of due diligence that you want to follow going forward. I would recommend looking at coming up with a set of standards, going out, doing an advertisement, doing some interviews, getting some references, things of that nature. The problem was at that time, there were so few firms that we seemed to have access to that did this type of work that we were just delighted as all heck to have these folks come in, and they started looking at the files that we had, where we had them stored, how many were simply rolled up, how many were actually in files, how many that were in condensed files in our building. And they started measuring by the foot of files to determine what the cost was going to be. And a fairly staggering amount, quite frankly, before we were all said and done. But in any event, decisions were made to select the firm, and I won't bring their name up, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment, but we won't bring up their name. But they said, okay, well, what we need you to do is we need you to make a record of each of these files. And then when you're done making those records, we'll take those files, take them to our facility and start making the copies of them. Fine. Unfortunately, when you are short-staffed and you have people assigned to different things, two things very quickly become evident. One is when there's no one in charge of the project per se. And two, when the staff that's assigned to that changes on an almost daily basis, depending on who happens to have some free time. The problem that comes up from that is that suddenly the file naming conventions changed over the course of, depending on who was copying, who was making up the notes on that particular file on any given day. It might be an address, It might be a tax parcel number. And if those things didn't seem to exist, suddenly the file naming convention turned into the name of the engineer or the name of a company or something of that nature. We can all figure out what happens later on when you go searching later on in electronic format for a specific file. If you're not using the right one, then you can't find it again, at least not in the electronic format. So there was a pressure, if you will, to come up with this solution and to complete it as quickly as possible, because we were going to be ready to move to a new building, and we had to have these things done before we ever did that. So anyway, the firm was sent all of our documents. What they would do is, as we completed our labeling process, we would contain them, and then the company would come in and take them away to a facility, I believe down in Maryland, where they would then copy the files. I can tell you personally that we probably took something like 60 or 70 large bags of documents weighing anywhere between 40 to 80 pounds, loading them onto vans and having the vans take them away, and then come back a month or so later with the electronic version that had been done. Can we change the next page? Thank you. Results. The documents came back, and that was great, and we were provided CDs. And for those of you who actually may still have a CD player in your office, that gives you an idea of how far along back we were dealing with. We do have other versions of those files, but CDs, as we look at them now, seem particularly useless. We still are storing the hard copies off-site in a township building, which is a good thing. The sorting and searching of individual projects, by and large, does not work worth a darn. If you're looking for a tax parcel, some are filed that way, some are not. So one has to do a little bit of a, if you will, Sherlock Holmes sleuthing expedition sometimes to find these files. Fortunately, these are files that we don't have to access routinely, but at the same time, it was one of the most cumbersome tasks that we possibly could have picked in the township. So if you're ever thinking about doing one of these things, I would recommend maybe starting with a smaller contained version of a file project, and then maybe work up from there when you kind of get used to that, versus taking the most difficult one right out of the box. It also turns out that the version of the municipal complex that we were looking at 8 years ago was then canceled for other entirely separate reasons. So kind of the reason d'etre, if you will, for why we were doing this project 8 years ago kind of went away. And as I said, the project suffered from not having a dedicated manager, of not having a dictated file naming methodology that we're going to use that was consistent, and having staff working on the project that didn't really understand or know the types of files that they were dealing with. And some of that had to do a little bit with personnel transitions and things of that nature, and frankly, just availability of staff at that time. So let's go to another page. I'm sorry, next page, please. These are lessons learned. Please have a manageable project scope. Picking the largest, most difficult project coming out of the box is possibly not the best way to go. Smaller, discrete projects that you can then monitor as you're going along to see if they're working properly, versus the solution process of let's get all of these files out of here, get them all copied, and then magically it will all work. It doesn't necessarily happen that way. Due diligence in selecting a document company is absolutely critical, especially if you're not doing it in-house. The size of our files, the number of our files, and frankly, the delicate nature of some of those files made it impossible for us to do it. And while we were happy to send those things to a remote location, it was necessary, but probably would have done better if we were a little bit further in the history of the technology, that we could have chosen a better company at that time. Once again, have an absolute workable file naming protocol for dependable file retrieval. That's been spoken about a couple of times, and I strongly recommend it. Don't tie a large project to an inadequate schedule. There was a lot of pressure about this has to be done by a certain date as soon as possible. That's not a good way to ensure that you're going to have the quality control that you need going forward. And finally, don't overpromise and underdeliver. Don't tell everyone, yes, we're going to have this great new project, and then not be able to pull it off. It's a project that ultimately we will end up having to redo significant parts of that to make the project work. And at the time that we did that, we were using regular township funds to do that. The funds from the feds were not ready at that time, and certainly we're not looking forward to using, that methodology again. We've learned a lot, quite frankly. The people who have talked to you already today in terms of what they can do, how they can do, how not to file things, please listen to them. Coming up with a bad solution is a really bad idea, and the type of thing you continue to suffer from for quite some time. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you do have. If you want to email them to me, ask me at the end of the session. Be happy to chat with you about it. It's a great project at the end of the day to be involved with, because you want to keep these files as long as absolutely necessary. You want to have them available to people because very often they will need a copy of a document, especially in our case, a blueprint or something of that nature, if they're going back to work on a building that was created 40 years ago. But at the same time, make sure this is a project you've absolutely planned out, you have the best possible people, and you have a schedule that you can work with. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kim. Now, our last speaker, Vince, will be talking about doing in-house scanning. So a little different.
Good morning. I'm Vince Vasauskas. I'm the Finance and IT Director for Middletown Township, Delaware County, southeastern Pennsylvania. I guess I'm here to tell you, if you're up for a little bit of a challenge, you can certainly do this yourself, kind of give you some guidelines in order to do that. Let me share my screen with you. So a little bit about my background, so you have a kind of a framework for tackling a project like this yourself. I do have over, 30 years experience in local governments. I've worked for 2 counties and 3 townships in various roles. Sorry, go back. I digitized some records in one of the counties and all of the townships. They were kind of various projects that the municipalities wanted to work on. When I worked for the county, we did some 911 addressing and getting all that information into the system to start a 911 system, enhanced system. Some of the other townships, we had various different kind of projects. Some were just trying to get our codes information in as well. Some were, when it was smaller municipality, was just getting in all of our scanned minutes and records like that. And one of my larger municipalities, we tried to go back in time over 30 years and get all of our subdivision plans in, like some of the other presenters. The municipalities I worked in, the population varied from 4,000 to 16,000 folks. Some had a lot of resources. Others only had 2 full-time staff. We didn't have a lot of money to go out and hire people, so we tried to do a lot of it in-house. Like I said, every place that I worked was very different and had different objectives of what they wanted to get out of their records and why they wanted to get them computerized. Other than myself, none of the municipalities that I worked for in any of the townships had their own IT staff. They all used outside consultants for IT staff. Just a little bit of background about myself. I don't have a computer background. I'm certainly don't consider myself an expert. Kind of how I got into this, I kind of fell into it because I was working for a county and we were working on a project, and all of the county IT folks just kept leaving for higher paying jobs. So in order to get my, my project done, I had to learn how to do it. But all of that being said, I think if I can handle it, you certainly can too if you want to do it. And I'll give you some tips about how to approach projects like this. My first township that I worked for, we wanted to scan our old building permits so we could look them up easier. And this was about 20 years ago. So at that time, we just used a spreadsheet, a desktop scanner, and we had summer high school help that came in. And we just developed a format. After the high school help was done and putting it in the spreadsheet, we just put it on our server, and we look things up as we needed them. In my second township, we wanted to get all of our subdivision plans scanned. So we actually had a local engineering firm. They had a homemade database that they used in-house, and we got a couple of interns to do the work. At that time, I think they were scanning images, which were called TIFF images. And we just kept them on a database on our server. And when we wanted to look things up, we could pull up the images. In my current township, we have a more robust staff, and we use a larger commercial document management software package. And our staff actually, as some of the previous folks have said, our staff incorporated as part of their daily, business process model. So if they're printing out minutes that they've just done for the supervisors, we also drop that into our document management software. Some very good guidelines for doing it yourself. Again, don't try to bite the whole apple all at once. Start with smaller, well-defined projects and certainly build from there. And if you do start to choose a small project to begin with, Tony's Getting Started slides are a great starting point. They have exactly kind of what you need to follow in order to start a project. Another thing to consider if you are going to store the stuff on site, and even if you're not and you have to do it off site, determine your storage and backup needs, not only today, but what you're going to need probably 5 years down the road, because usually servers or computers, they're supposed to last between 3 and 5 years. So make sure you size that for what your needs will be in the future. Pretty much any newer computer can handle scanning. And if you do have a server, figure how much space is available to store your documents. Computers and storage and even offsite online storage is much cheaper than it used to be. I also know some intermediate units in northeastern Pennsylvania. They also offer storage. You can piggyback on their storage, and it's really cheap. You can do that offsite, and it's secure. If you are going to scan it in-house, again, figure out if your multifunction office copiers can scan. That's usually the best option for everything that isn't huge. You could take some huge stuff out to get it scanned. You can even go to like a FedEx, Kinko's kind of place, and you can do it there. A key thing, just jumping on what Kim said, is determine what your index will be if you have your own project. Just like folder title in your paper filing cabinet, you have to be consistent, and everybody has to know how to look up the information once you put it in there. So before you start, figure out how to do that. Some of my projects, we use tax parcel numbers. Other ones we would use, the subdivision name. Currently, in my current municipality, everybody uses the street name. we can find things by street name, and you can usually relate that back to whatever other, tax parcel information or subdivision name or things like that. Try to pick things that don't change very often for when you're doing your index. Just some quick tricks of the trade or takeaways that I've learned over the years. Digitizing records is not a one and done kind of project. Don't think that you're going to get it done and then move on to something else. Data gets stale really fast. And unless you have somebody entering new info in your system as it comes in, then all the money and effort that you put in originally kind of gets lost. It definitely is an ongoing commitment once you start. And again, you will need a staff person assigned as a project manager, whether you do it in-house or with a consultant. And if you do have an in-person staff kind of liaison or manager, they kind of need to understand from your user perspective what the users need out of it, and kind of convey that to the consultants to let the consultants know what you need out of the project. So that's kind of a key person you're going to have assigned. Another thing I've learned over the years is, remember, your data is always yours, no matter what software vendor or provider you choose. But you have to make sure that you can access your files without their software. I've used a provider who shall remain nameless, but we got all of our information into the system. It was kind of automatically assigned these crazy file names in the PDFs. When we decided we were unhappy with their software and we tried to move to another provider, yes, we had our data, but we basically didn't have that Rosetta Stone of comparing your file index and what you wanted to get out of it with the actual files that were digitized. So you have to make sure that things are kind of convertible and you can always kind of track them down. As everybody said today, local governments are drowning in paper. That is starting to change. I guess my top recommendation to get out of my presentation today is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Adopt some of the best practices to reduce your paper records, follow the records retention schedules, but make the effort to purge your old records yearly. Create a list of unneeded paper docs and get your elected officials to pass a resolution authorizing the destruction. We tend to do it in January after the budget is passed, and we're trying to make room for our new paper in our filing cabinets for the upcoming year. We will go and take all of our old paper records out, put them in a storage facility, and then the ones that are near the end of their lifespan, we will pull back into the office and we'll do a list of those, and then we'll give that to the elected officials so we can authorize the destruction of that. And then the final thing is, if you can, change all of your ordinances to require the submission of digital records so you don't have to scan the records yourself, especially in engineering and surveying. Pretty much every engineer does everything digitally now, so it doesn't make a whole ton of sense for them to print out paper copies for you that you have to scan again in order to get into your system. We've done that, and we also require the paper submittal of subdivision plans and things like that, so our planning commission can review it by paper. But again, don't do the effort twice if you don't have to. So here's my contact information. I appreciate the time today to kind of inform you of some of the things that I've done. Again, feel free to reach out to me if you have an upcoming project, and I can help you scope it out or walk through it. Thanks.
Thank you, Vince. So now we'd like to start sharing some questions that you have with our panel and see what they have to say about them. So let me start. Okay. So the first question we have is, it would seem a huge risk with document management software that is to become obsolete after a period of time, requiring migrating all the documents and metadata to a different system, expensive, labor intensive. Do any of the participants have any suggestions?
This is Tony. I can kind of weigh in on that, or I'll do my best. Depending on the software package that you're engaged with, most of the decent document management software houses your records, whatever, hopefully in PDFA format. There should be an export function that it's relatively a simple back-end process that can be used to back up or extract those records out of that system in their native format, retaining the metadata that can be easily then batch uploaded to another system. A little bit of technical stuff, but it's not as daunting as it may sound. And again, it depends on the software, but I know working with a number of different packages, that is a relatively comparatively easy task.
Okay, our next question is, what would be the average cost and time frame to complete a scanning project? I know that's kind of broad, but if anybody could answer maybe on specific one that they were doing.
Well, I don't want to try and dominate the responses, but from an outsourcing provider's perspective, it really depends on the volume and the complexity of the project. And is there a records assessment and review that needs to occur prior to beginning the project? Is it something where you have some records that are nicely organized where you can start the scanning while at the same time the stuff in the basement and the boxes is being reviewed? So there's a number of many variables. I can tell you so it's kind of hard to estimate a timeline. Just for lack of a better term, a spitball estimate on the cost. Somewhere between $150 to $200 per 1.2 cubic foot box is maybe a somewhat good estimate. But again, that varies based on the number of large format that might be interspersed within that box, or how much double-sided. So there's a lot of things that can drive that. And if you work with an outsourcing provider, I would certainly make sure that they come out and do an assessment and give you some kind of a proposal or a cost estimate or quote on the project, so you know what you're up against. And I know it's probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's really the best in a nebulous type of situation.
I can offer a little bit of perspective on the various projects that I've worked on. If you wanted to do something as simple as scanning in all of the old minutes in the municipality, you can probably do that with staff, and you can probably do that, as time allows. So, but you could get that accomplished part-time within a year. When I did our codes records, we had, I think it was one high schooler all summer and another half high schooler all summer. We were trying to get 10 years of records in. They were able to get about 5 years of records in during the summer, so over a 3-month time period. So those are kind of the time frames. One recommendation that I would make is, what I've found is the more recent information you look up more regularly than older stuff. So if you're going to start scanning stuff, start with the more recent information first, and then work your way back towards whatever time period that you want to get to.
All right, our next question is, Keldine, will you share your costs? Cost.
The cost, sure. So just to give you an idea, now, when I had said this was a long, the slow and steady approach, I was not, it absolutely was. I mean, we started a few years ago with the purging process and the review and the proper disposal, et cetera. And then it kind of got put on the back burner. When the funds became available with ARPA, that was when we moved into action with contracting services. I asked council to approve up to $12,000 worth of expenditures for the scanning process, the professional scanning. And we have not used up all of those funds. Like I said, we still have a portion of the basement to go through. And as Tony indicated, there's so many variables in that, from the maps to, the legal size documents that were inside binders. So you have the old documents there, minutes and things, from the 20s and 30s and 40s, things that may not be required to keep, but for historical purposes were beneficial to preserve. So it was kind of a blended mix based, on that in all of our decision along the way. So again, it's just been a step by step, but we tried to, contain a certain budget amount, and that has been working for us so far.
Great, thank you for those insights. I'm Josh Stallman from the Pennsylvania State Archives, by the way. I was just going to ask the next question that we had received here in the Q&A, and I think this one was directed at Kim, if I'm not mistaken. Why did you choose HIG, and did you look at other options?
No, HIG was not our choice. Kelly, I'm not sure if that was yours or someone else's.
That was ours. Yes,
no,
that's
that
who I used.
wasn't ours, and you can't drag the name of the firm we used out of me. Sorry.
All right, so I guess that one would go back to you, Keldine.
Yes, we had actually I had met them through a mutual friend, and we ended up we needed a new copier service, and we actually engaged with them through that, only to find out some of the other services that they do provide, and one of them was the scanning, and they have done that for other municipalities in the region. So that's why we chose to go that direction. And it was a good quote, so.
All right, thanks, Keldine. My name is Tyler Stump. I'm another archivist here, so we're taking turns asking questions to everyone. So the next one that we have here in the question section is there a standard taxonomy for file cataloging? Because that seemed like a helpful way to facilitate the startup for the process. So if anybody wants to talk about how maybe you determined what a standard way to catalog your files, or any other thoughts you might have on that.
In the case of a codes office, I think we all decided somewhat belatedly that our preference would have been to use tax parcel. That's the one thing that doesn't seem to change a whole lot and was a consistent piece of information going back decades. So that would have been our, with hindsight indeed being 2020.
I can add to that. Now, we, as I mentioned, are a very small staff, small municipality. We know many individuals by name, and we're familiar with addresses, and most of our day-to-day functions are based off of addresses. So we have started logging those and trying to bring all of the information into one specific folder per address, but also with the parcel as the extension, because that's the formal recognition on the tax side.
In my case, we chose not to use the tax parcel numbers. We're in a fairly rapidly growing portion of southeastern Pennsylvania, so tax parcels get subdivided all the time. So we felt that addresses were a better way to get all the information that we needed out of it.
The next question we have is, does anyone have a site for the legal authority that ARPA funds can be used for digitization?
I can address that. I'm assuming that most of the folks on this this webinar are the money that they got from ARPA was less than $10 million. With the final rule in ARPA, basically you can basically state that anything under $10 million is general revenue replacement, and you can basically use it for anything. So that's probably the best citation there. Again, if you shoot me an email, I can find you the exact citation for the final rule on that.
All right, thank you, Vince. We have a question here asking if you can contact the State Archives for a visit or direction, reviewing, discussing files and costs and so forth. Absolutely, feel free to reach out to us. I'll put our contact information in the chat. Again, Cindy Benroth, Josh Stallman, Ty Stump. We are available to consult. Specifically, we can provide information about the municipal record schedule, the municipal manual, which indicates different record series and types and how long things need to be kept, as well as the details regarding the PDFA policy and otherwise. But certainly we're available as well, email, phone call, to discuss records management issues as far as how things should be stored, where to store them, best conditions, best practices, and things of that nature. In some cases, we are able to do site visits. It's been more limited in recent years, and we are looking at a building move here in the coming months. So we're a little bit limited in what we're able to do as far as going out in the field right now, but certainly glad to chat via phone or email or otherwise, and do what we can to help get you on track. And I'll put our contact information again in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Josh. The next question that we have from the audience is there a time frame that the records have to be scanned by? And so I'll preface that a little bit. There's no requirement from the state, so from our office, that requires that records have to be scanned in a certain amount of time. But I was wondering if any of our panelists could just comment on the length of time that it's taken you to scan records, and if you have any thoughts on kind of what your timeline looks like, or any advice for other folks about that.
I could just reiterate, there's no rush for us. We have a very practical balance of, the time that we have, to address it. Or if we can get to that end goal, I mean, generally speaking, it would be great if we can finish it all out and have it nicely organized on the computer network by the end of the year. Great.
I guess I would add, if you're kind of doing a project yourself, set realistic deadlines, because you know how busy all of us get. And if you don't have a goal for when you want to get stuff in, other priorities are going to pop up, and it's just you're not going to get to it. So if that's something like, I'm going to spend an hour a week scanning something, just kind of stick to that, and eventually everything will get done.
All right, thank you. Another question that we have is, how many of your documents were not scannable or legible after scanning? And how did you handle the storage of these documents that could not be scanned?
I can just say that we didn't have, at least to date, we haven't noticed an issue with them not being readable or finding another copy. Somehow in this old building, they managed to remain, in somewhat decent quality, be able to do that. Now, there is very brittle paper that we did handle ourselves here in-house. We didn't just stick it in a box and ship it over to the facility for scanning. But that is a small amount of documents, so that was definitely manageable in-house.
I've had the experience where I've had some older subdivision plans that were on Mylar that are kind of very difficult to scan. So we would actually have to go out and make blueprint copies of that and then scan those copies in. So it was an extra step, but we overcame it.
Great, thank you for those responses. We do have a question here regarding the distinction as to when to use standard PDFA or I guess the different versions of PDFA. So there's PDFA 1A, PDFA 2A, and B and C and so forth and so on. I'll add just a brief little tidbit of information, I guess, that stands to be of value, but maybe some of the others could comment on what particular incarnation they've been using. So we actually received a question recently, again, at the State Archives about the versioning of PDFA. And as I mentioned, there's PDFA 1A, PDFA 2, PDFA 3, and so forth. And we've made the determination, which is actually in a little bit of odds with some of the guidance that may be out there. Those subsequent versions, so the policy, the PDFA standard is defined by ISO 19005 and subsequent revisions and future standards. So each one of those later versions would therefore be applicable to that ISO standard. And that's what we have been telling folks when we get that question. Again, I understand that PDFA is sort of the standard level that is recommended in that ISO standard, and PDFA B is more of a basic level of that format. I'd be glad to discuss that further, and I have some resources I could send out, links or otherwise verbiage to you if you have more direct questions for us regarding that. Be glad to provide that information, and otherwise if any of the presenters have experience with the format that they had chosen or that they utilize in their processes, we'd be glad to hear that.
I'm going to come out of the closet a little bit here. About half of my records are not in PDFA, and we're getting there. But what I would recommend is, even though they may not be archival quality, having a digital record is better than not having a digital record for looking things up and access. So you have to start somewhere. You may not want to start for the gold standard, but you can get there eventually.
All right, thanks, Vince. There's a question in the webinar chat that I wanted to ask, and someone asked, how is PDFA secure when anyone who has Adobe Pro can click on enable editing and change the document? And I'll just kind of preface that my understanding of the PDFA file format is when you save it as a PDFA, that locks the document so that if somebody wants to modify it, you would actually have to create a separate document. When you save something as a PDFA, that particular file cannot be modified. Now, that being said, I wanted to ask everybody, and maybe Tony, you might have some thoughts on this, but have you ever had issues where documents were saved as PDFA and then there was a need to go back and either modify that document or change it in some way? And was that ever kind of a hiccup in the workflow, or was it just an issue that you've ever had to deal with anyone?
Yeah, Tyler, to be honest with you, we have not had that issue occur. Typically, if it's a document that a customer will anticipate modifying or updating, they might want to save the original in a PDFA, but leave the original, or to save a copy as a PDFA, then leave the original in its native format, whether it be Word or whatever, and do it like that. And that's where, again, with document management software, versioning comes in, and you can save multiple versions of the documents.
Let's see. Leaving up one question, how does one scan an old property survey with regular desktop scanner? Can you do that? Does anybody know?
I haven't done it recently, but you know, back when I used like an 11x17 flatbed scanner and we needed to do subdivision plans and we didn't have any other option, you can certainly tile it. You can kind of make it into quarters and do each quarter. You're going to have some overlap, but it gets it digitized.
All right, anybody else? All right, I'll just go ahead. Oh, here's a question that we could probably answer is, with the digitization of municipal records, is this a must happen or can they be left in paper files? Yes, they can be left in paper files. There's no requirement that you must go electronic. So that's really up to your municipality, whether you want to do that. But again, we were trying to show what the different efficiencies and things like that. But if it's just not within your capability, yes, you can keep things as paper records.
Now, I'll just jump on with that a little bit, Cindy. I know some of our speakers talked a little bit about some records that aren't appropriate for digitizing and for scanning. But I was just wondering if anybody wanted to jump in and if there are any particular records that you would advise most municipalities to not scan and maybe why those wouldn't be good ideas to scan those types of records. I know one thing that we've talked about a lot is a lot of transitory records. So things that they have very short retention periods. I think Tony talked about this a little bit, but things that you only have to keep maybe for 6 months or a year or something like that. Sometimes it's not worth the time to scan because you're not even going to keep that particular piece of paper for very long. But if anybody else wants to jump in with other thoughts about things that aren't great candidates for scanning, I'd love to hear more about that.
Tyler, this is Tony. I can just weigh in on that to kind of piggyback. You know, if I'm at a customer and you know, they really have, you know, priorities and they want to prioritize with a limited budget, you know, the first thing we look at is, you know, financial files, accounting, AP, AR. You know, these are invoices, a 7-year retention period. You really, you know, especially if it's not a large township or municipality, they can set them aside and hold them and just continue to cycle through them and purge them every year, as opposed to scanning them and uploading them. Unless they have a, you know, a real, you know, a high volume of invoices and accounts payable, a bigger environment where it makes sense to have access to them. But you know, if I start looking at stuff and try to make decisions, helping them make decisions of what to scan and what not to scan, a lot of that financial stuff would be put on the back burner and held. And anything, again, certainly with 3 years or less remaining, I would not scan that.
I'll just second that as a finance director. We basically put all of our newer finance records in because we're able to do that with our software. We don't want to take the effort to go back in and scan the paper financial records that were here when I started. Just doesn't make sense.
Great, those are great answers. I actually just received a message. Another document that might not be a good candidate for scanning could be photographs that are being used as evidence in court or litigation. And so that's a good question where I would definitely recommend any municipality check with your solicitor if you have records that may be needed as evidence to make sure that if you have a local requirement that they must be in hard copy and paper copy, that might not be another one, not a great idea to scan that, but that's definitely something to ask about first. So, okay.
I will also say that I worked for one municipality that did have a police force, and retention of police records and access to police records is just a totally different ballgame than what I was used to. So definitely, you know, talk to your police chief, talk to your solicitor, get advice before you try to tackle any of that.
Yeah, so I was going to jump in. We actually prior to the session in registration, we had fielded some questions as well. And one of them that sort of tied into this, and Vince, what you just mentioned, and Ty and some of the others, those were maybe examples of things that maybe best left in their physical form or their native form. But the question that we received was, what's the advantage of digitizing records if most of them need to be kept as a hard copy as well? That's part one of the question. And part two is, before going through the expense and time of digitization, I'd like a clearer understanding of what needs to be kept indefinitely versus what can be destroyed at some point. And the way that I would answer that for the group here, again, feel free to reach out to me to talk about this more in depth, but at a higher level, the way that I respond to that is, the Municipal Records Manual essentially spells out the records retention for various series of records, of course, but also the digitization policy, or the PDFA policy that's spelled out in the Municipal Records Manual, indicates that in most cases, once those records have been digitized in accordance with that policy, and a resolution is passed by the municipality, those physical records then, again, in most cases, can be disposed of. So that is sort of one of the benefits of this whole digitization process, as some of the presenters or speakers had mentioned previously, is that dire need for space that we often encounter. So again, that PDFA policy, it's not prescriptive, but it is something that's a tool, it's an option that would allow you to ultimately dispose of the originals. And it's sort of, in the past, a lot of municipalities, county governments, and otherwise would microfilm records in order to dispose of those originals. But again, this PDFA policy allows the electronic management of those permanent or long-term records. And along those lines, we're talking about digitization today. So, taking things that don't exist electronically and making them electronic records. This would also apply for born digital records as well. So those things that never existed in a physical form can be managed. Those permanent records can be managed electronically to satisfy retention. And again, I'd be glad to chat more in depth about that with you if you'd want to reach out to me personally, or to Ty or Cindy as well.
Great, thanks, Josh. I have another question that was emailed to us earlier before the event today. But somebody was looking for information on converting large commercial building plans to electronic, so scanning like big oversized things. I know a few of you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering if any of our presenters wanted to talk a little bit more about your experience with large oversized things and either what to do or what not to do with them.
I guess I've done it in-house, so I can give you a what I've done. We currently, I'm in a larger municipality now, so we do have our own large format plotter that also scans. But when I was in a smaller municipality, as I said in my presentation, we would just take some of the larger paper files and either go to a FedEx office or a Kinko's, and you can either have them do it, or you can actually do it yourself and just scan it in there, and you'll have the file then. Also, another thing is chances are your engineer can do it for you. If they're a mid-sized engineering firm, they probably have the equipment and they can do the scanning for you.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt now because we've worked down most of the questions. I think if there are more specific ones, please feel free to contact State Archives, and we've put the contact information in the chat. These are great questions, and we're always here to help you as much as we can with a limited staff and resources, but we know you're in the same situation, so you understand. I just want to thank our speakers, Anthony, Vince, Kim, Keldine. From my perspective, you all just hit the ball out of the park. And I think probably the participants agree, the attendees agree. You were very practical, you were right on target, and I appreciate it deeply. And I think the attendees too. I want to thank everyone who attended and for your attention and your questions. And we will try to continue to provide webinars like this on topics that we hope will help you. And so thank you again and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.